So yeah, before I put up that presentation, one of the things that is very important for becoming important for us at OAI, and OAI is just one partner to that, is in fact the deployment of ORAN and automation and the OCloud aspects. So what we decided to do at this workshop, and we have some of the best people in this area, is to have a discussion about how that space looks like and what is the role of different open source communities there. What is OAI bringing? What is Nefio doing right now? And what are the objectives and goals of OSC in this area? So that's where we will have the panel focusing at. And before before getting the panel here and start talking about those things, we have a short presentation video by Tal, who's a Google engineer. And he's one of the main sort of persons in Nefio. He's one of the biggest contributors, and he's here explaining what, in his view, Nefio is. So let's start with that.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I apologize that I can't be in person. For personal reasons, I could not travel, but I'm very happy to have this opportunity to present the Nefio project to you. My name is Tal. I'm at Google Cloud, and let's go. So what is Nefio? It is a platform for deploying network functions on Kubernetes clusters. That covers quite a lot. We aim to cover day 0, the design, day 1, the initial deployment, and day 2 changes to network functions. And by this, I mean cloud native changes that involve self-orchestration of the components. We intend to be multi-vendor and multi-cloud. So that means supporting many different cloud platforms out there, as long as they're Kubernetes, and supporting any network function vendor. Included here in scope is also the infrastructure of the cloud platforms, by which we mean both software and hardware. So the scope of this is complex, but as we know, network functions are very tightly vertically integrated workloads that require working with the infrastructure. It's not enough just to deploy them on Kubernetes as pods and services, but to actually work with the infrastructure underneath to satisfy their specific requirements. The approach of Nefio is declarative orchestration. Probably that's obvious if we're deploying on Kubernetes. Everything in Kubernetes is flat KRM, the Kubernetes resource model. So everything is a Kubernetes resource. Of course, we're assuming here that there are a lot of custom resources on top of Kubernetes. And here we extend Kubernetes via operators, as well as provide an SDK to help you create your own. And I'll talk more about that in the next slides. Another important approach of Nefio is what we call at Google configuration as data, or CAD. Here, what we mean is that, well, think of it this way, right? Infrastructure of code has been a very popular approach to managing infrastructure, right? Because code is something textual that you can work with and change, but code is very hard to maintain at scale. You do it once, you test it, and then it's there. To change it later is very hard. Data is much more easily manipulated, right? And we have so many tools to do that, including using artificial intelligence, right, to change the data. So a lot of Nefio has to do with manipulating data. Nefio is open source, Apache license, and it's part of Linux Foundation networking, which is a great ecosystem where we can join with other projects that work on telco. It started off with seed code from Google, but I can tell you that we've moved way beyond the initial seed code at this point. The traditional wall of logos here. You can probably not see all the details here, but you can go to the website and find out more. I imagine that this list will continue to grow as we get more and more support for Nefio. Some of the history, just to put it in context, the project started last year. It started off at Linux Foundation. Soon after, we hosted our first technical summit in Sunnyvale, California. And that was a great time to get the community together and discuss what we're actually trying to achieve here together. This year, we released our Nefio R1, and we were very proud of that release. The community came together to create it, and it's pretty well documented and available for download right now. Our release cadence is intended to be every 6 months. So by January of next year, we intend to release Nefio R2, and we're working very hard on it right now. Just last month, we had our second technical summit in Mountain View, California. And at the same time, we announced that Nefio joined into Linux Foundation networking. So that's where we're hosted. What's the organizational structure? So we have a few sections, and all of them have an elected chair and vice chair. And we're in the middle of elections right now. When the project started with the Google sponsorship, Google did reserve the chair positions for itself. But now that the project has really moved forward, and we no longer have that requirement. So really, anybody can be nominated to be either chair or vice chair for any of these sections. We have a technical steering committee, and we have 4 special interest groups. SIG number 1 is called Network Architecture, and there we have a bunch of work groups for designing the use cases, modeling, user experience, policy frameworks, and the general roadmap for the project. So SIG number 1 is where we generate requirements for the entire project. And here we have a lot of activity right now on ORAN integration. As you can probably notice that all of this is very important for integration with ORAN. So a lot of folk who are involved in Nefio are actually also involved in ORAN, and there's very direct cross-pollination between the projects. SIG number 2, automation, is where we do most of the development work, the coding. And again, we've divided it into various task forces that deal with the Nefio platform itself, integration with infrastructure, observability, and developing our SDK. So if you're an engineer, this is where you want to sit. Or maybe I should fix that. If you're an engineer, you might also want to be involved in SIG 3, which is our release SIG. This is a very important SIG that manages the continuous development and integration and end-to-end testing for the entire project. Packaging as well, and by packaging I mean here packaging of Nefio itself, but also packaging of the vendor extensions and blueprints and operators, right? So this is also where a lot of work on the SDK is being done. We also announced a new SIG, security, just recently, and I'm very excited to see it grow and see more people participate. We take security very, very seriously here because there's so much data involved, and it needs to be very, very safe. So how is Nefio, how does it work, right? What are the components? What is the basic architecture? I'll note that this is a very, very high level diagram, but it can give you a sense of where Nefio sits in your management and deployment ecosystem, right? So I'll start by mentioning that Nefio assumes a management cluster, right, which is itself a Kubernetes cluster. And this becomes important because it means that all our components are running on Kubernetes and using Kubernetes and the Kubernetes resource model very directly. You'll see here in the teal color, these are the Nefio components. So much of Nefio sits here in the management cluster, right? I call this Nefio configuration management. Internally, it's subdivided into many other components, but its main goal is to work with the repositories that you see here on the right. Repositories can be Git, OCI, and this is where we store the blueprints. So the orange color is everything coming from third parties, right? So blueprints include network function blueprints, topology blueprints, and various infrastructure related blueprints, right, that can be joined with that, right? So what configuration management does here, it takes those blueprints and according to the intended deployment topology, and takes the user inputs for it, right? So inputs into the topology, the relationships between components, etc., and turns them into deployable resources, right? So again, we're dealing here 100% Kubernetes resources, but what it does, it takes those blueprints, fills in all the necessary data, and pushes it back into the repository in another section for the sites. Now what we have here is resources that are ready to be deployed on one or more clusters, right? It can be 100,000 clusters. And how we get from the sites to the workload clusters is very cloud dependent. At Google Cloud, what we do, we have a component called config sync that talks directly to these repositories and simply deploys the components there. But for other cloud vendors, there will be other systems, right? So we're working on integrating all of those. I'll talk about that in the next slide. Everything in the workload clusters, of course, comes from vendors, right? That's where the network functions themselves run. But that's also where vendors can include their own operators to manage those network functions, right? So if you think of the traditional VNFM model, some of the work that VNFMs do can be done here in the workload clusters where they're right next to the network functions, right? I sometimes call that side-by-side orchestration. But you'll see that we have another orange box here in the management cluster for vendor and cloud operators. The point being that vendors can include their own extended code as part of the configuration as data process, right? So they can work with Nefio to inject data that is very specific to them, right? Nefio is generic. Nefio doesn't know every cloud and network function in depth and doesn't know what they need, but vendors can include their own injection and manipulation data there. And artificial intelligence can work in both in the management cluster and the workload cluster, right, in this case. Right? The Nefio SDK component that I'm showing here on the side is very important because it helps you can see the T lines going to the operators, build those operators. Building operators for Kubernetes is non-trivial. Building good ones is even harder. And we intend to have this SDK include all the best practices and tooling needed to get you on board as quickly as possible into the Nefio ecosystem. And these operators too don't necessarily need to use Nefio, right? If you use the Nefio SDK to create an operator for your network function, you don't necessarily have to use Nefio to deploy it. So we find the Nefio SDK to be valuable even if you're not using everything else in Nefio. However, it is intended to be tightly integrated with, or allow you for tight integration with Nefio configuration management. On the left, you'll see here CLI or GUI. So we do provide a nice web GUI. It's rather simple at this point for interacting with the system. But you'll see there's also a dotted line going directly to repositories. And here, you have the GitOps approach, which lets you direct access to the Git repositories. Remember, the repositories just store Kubernetes resources. So if you need to, you can avoid or interject into the complete automation system and do manual work directly with the repositories. For example, you might want to approve every automation process with a human operator, and you can absolutely do that in Nefio. What do we support right now? So this is definitely a work in progress and increasing. We started off in release 1 with the free 5GC components. Right? As an open source project, we are limited to integrating open source directly. However, we really would love vendors to provide production network functions that we can integrate and work with and find a way to incorporate and test. With R2, we're very happy to include OpenAirInterface components. OpenAirInterface folks are involved in Nefio and are doing amazing work at getting it packaged with operators and onboarded into the Nefio ecosystem. So this is very exciting. And we're working on use cases that will make good use of OAI features that Free5GC does not have. The cloud support right now is also growing. Obviously, we started with Google Cloud Support. That was part of Google Seed Code. But in progress is amazing work by the community to support Kubernetes on OpenStack, Red Hat's OpenShift, of course, and Amazon Cloud. And we hope for more. We have VMware and Wind River involved in Nefio, and we'd love to see it work on those clouds as well. And part of the SDK, again, I'll go back to the previous slide, is exactly to allow cloud vendors to include their specific support there. So we would love to have all of that as part of the Nefio release. Do you want to get involved? I hope you do. Our main website is nefio.org. So all of these are links. I hope the presentation can be shared so you can click on these. From the main website, you're able to get into everything else, of course, but I'll quickly point out what we have and give you some guidance on how to join. There's very good user documentation, as I mentioned, for Nefio R1. And when we release Nefio R2, we're going to update it for that. It includes a lot of in-depth text and a few video recordings of how to get started and run the initial use cases. We have mailing lists and meeting calendars, and I mentioned these together because we're managing the calendar there. So if you want to join our meetings, you need to join the mailing list, and that's how you'll get subscriptions to the calendar. It's a little bit confusing, but I'm happy to say we finally consolidated things there. We have an extremely active Slack channel, and I'll say this is where you want to be if you really want to get involved in Nefio. It's all the contributors are there talking, discussing, asking questions, answering questions, and it's really a great community and a great place to be. All our source code is on GitHub, so very easy to go there and get it. And I'll mention too that our SIG release has included a lot of GitHub actions that help us in our continuous development and testing, right? So we're pretty heavy users of GitHub here and their features. We store all our work documents in Google Drive, and there's a lot of documentation there, you know, for design, for proposals, and for comments, right? So all organization is done there. So that's it for now, and I'm very happy to be here virtually. I'm sorry I can't be in person, and yeah, thank you. Join us on the Nefio Slack. You can reach out to me directly with questions, and I hope to see you there and in person soon somewhere. I bumped into a bunch of people at KubeCon last week here in Chicago. That's where I'm seated, and I'm sure I'll see some of you in future tech summits for Nefio. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thank you, Tal.